Julian Nagelsmann is probably a name that you've heard in the last few weeks because everyone wants Julian Nagelsmann, but he's just been sacked by Bayern. So the big question is why? So this is Nagelsmann's CV. As you can see, he starts out life as a professional footballer, but is only a professional footballer for a short amount of time. He does have contracts with 1860 Munich and also FC Augsburg, but in 2008 he picks up a second of a knee injury that's actually eventually going to cause him to retire. Now you may notice that there's a big gap between him retiring as a professional footballer and then taking the job at Hoffenheim. And in that time, Julian Nagelsmann uses his time to better himself. He does some degrees at university in business, but also in sports science, and then goes into the coaching world. He spends some time coaching at 1860 Munich, where he was before he retired, and then joins the youth system at Hoffenheim. But then in the 2015-16 season, he is the assistant manager at Hoffenheim under Huub Stevens. Huub Stevens actually ends up leaving because of personal reasons, leaving Julian Nagelsmann at the age of 28, the youngest coach in the Bundesliga, with a club who are in the relegation zone and with only 14 games to turn things around. In the end, he wins 7 of those 14 games and Hoffenheim do stay up. But that starts this wonderful trajectory upwards where he gets Hoffenheim to the Champions League, gets RB Leipzig to a Champions League semi-final, and then wins the league with Bayern Munich last season. And we can see this great upward trajectory on the graph here, just showing the season finishes that Nagelsmann has had in the Bundesliga. We can see the first season here where he gets that 15th place finish, keeping Hoffenheim in the league, and then the following season a massive jump up, so now Hoffenheim are challenging for Champions League spots. That third place finish getting Hoffenheim to the Champions League, and then that resulting in a bit of a drop the following season because Hoffenheim don't have the squad depth to be able to deal with the Bundesliga and the Champions League competition as well. But this did not matter because already heads had been turning towards Hoffenheim's young manager, and in the following season Julian Nagelsmann ends up at RB Leipzig, gets them immediately into the Champions League spots of both of his seasons there, and actually takes them to a Champions League semi-final, which is the highest finish they've ever had in that tournament. And those heads kept on turning because after this second place finish in the Bundesliga with RB Leipzig, Bayern Munich came in and brought Julian Nagelsmann to the top club in the Bundesliga. It was the club that he'd supported since he was a kid, so it was his dream job, and that following season he managed to get a first place finish in the league. Now obviously this season hasn't gone quite so swimmingly, and with Bayern dropping off the top spot in the Bundesliga for one match week, the owners at Bayern decided that was enough evidence to get rid of Julian Nagelsmann, and he is now gone. But we're not here to talk about why Nagelsmann left Bayern, we're here to talk about why everyone wants to sign him as their manager, and I think this plot shows really nicely why that might be the case, because we see him coming in at a team who are struggling with relegation and he takes them up to the top half of the table. He joins a team who are challenging for the title and Champions League spots, and they comfortably do that, and then he goes to the best team in the league and he wins the league with them as well. So this is a manager who is really flexible, who can operate at any different team and make them much better. But where does this flexibility come from? Well, I've got a quote from Nagelsmann himself which explains a little bit about why he is so flexible. So Julian Nagelsmann says, "I give my players patterns that apply to every basic structure and every phase of play. It's important that my players put the principles we have into practice on the pitch at the weekend and then switch them to suit the respective opponent. This makes us less predictable." Now, the important word to see here is principles, because what Julian Nagelsmann is not doing is telling his team exactly how to behave in every moment. He's actually giving them the principles that they need to be able to interpret what's going on the field and be able to respond, make decisions, and in each situation they should be able to solve those problems between themselves, which is really good for flexibility because it allows you to change the way that you're playing depending on how the opposition are coming out. It makes you very unpredictable, as he says, but it makes it hard if you're making a video about Julian Nagelsmann and trying to explain how his tactics work. And this is the thing, because if you were to ask me what is it that Julian Nagelsmann's teams do, the answer is everything. They can do everything on a football pitch. They can play in a back 3 system, or they can play in a back 4 system. Their back 4 system can become a back 3 system by dropping out one of the central midfielders, or the back 3 system can become a back 4 system by pushing one of the centre backs forward. They can make their back 4 system into a back 3 system by pushing one of their fullbacks really high, like this, or they can make their back 5 system into a back 4 system by doing the same thing and everyone shuffling around with the other wing back dropping in here as well. They can play really slow, patient build-up football, moving the ball, controlling the ball and working it down the field, or they can play a long ball down the field to a striker who can head it on to a direct player who's then going to try and score. They can use width on either side, like this, or they can play super narrow in the middle. Out of possession, they could try and force the opposition wide into the wide areas and trap them against the sideline, or they might be a little bit more open in the centre and invite the passes through the middle. When those passes come in through the middle, it may be the case that the central midfielders are looking to intercept those passes before they arrive at the opponents. Or it may be the case that they're simply going to go player for player on the opponents to stop them from winning the ball there as well. All of which makes his teams super flexible, but I do want to give you a general sense of what to expect from the football of Julian Nagelsmann. And so if I was pressed, I would describe his play style as positional football, but with a different emphasis than most of your positional coaches. Now, when I say the words positional play to you, most of you will already in your heads be dividing the pitch up into these 5 channels. So we have a central space, we have 2 half spaces on either sides, and then we have the wide areas as well. And for most positional coaches, the most important idea is the rational occupation of these channels. So the idea is that you'll push your wingers high and wide in this wide channel, push your centre forward in the middle, your 8s can push up into the half spaces. And so your players are really nicely set up to exploit the spaces between a back 4. Now, the idea behind this is to generate as much space as possible through maximum width. So we've got our wingers here, you want them to be hugging the touchlines, that's going to pull the opposition fullbacks across, and again what you're doing then is just generating space in these areas that just make it easier for your team to be able to exploit the space in behind. Now, Nagelsmann is still interested in the concept of width himself, but rather than trying to maximize as much width as possible across the field, what he's going to do is use a concept called minimum width or relative width. What this means is that rather than his wide players being out on the touchline, they're going to be as narrow as they possibly can while still being on the other side of the player who is the widest player in this line here. So this instance here, we can see that minimum width is around this line here. So we're seeing a difference of about that amount of movement. So why might this matter? Because it seems like a really minute detail really, but there are a few benefits that you get by playing with this concept of minimum width. One of which is that you're bringing your players much closer together, which has a lot of benefits. The first one of those is that you're able to pass the ball much quicker because these passes are much shorter than these passes. The other thing that it allows you to do as well is if you lose the ball, then you're much closer to the play to then be able to counter-press and win the ball back. There's also a final benefit in that when you're counter-attacking, it's much better to have your forward players narrow because they're much closer to the goal. So let's say the ball's turned over here, we play it to the player in a minimum width position, it's much easier for them to attack the goal, whereas if we played it to the player in the maximum width position, they're much further away from the goal, so it's much easier for them to be defended. But it's important to remember that this is still a form of positional football because you're still thinking about manipulating the opposition, stretching their back line to create space to exploit. But positional football isn't all about creating space horizontally, it's also about creating space vertically. And one of the things that you'll notice from Julian Nagelsmann's teams is that he's constantly trying to find players in between the lines of pressure that the opposition set up out of possession. So you'll see often many players in these sorts of central areas here trying to win the ball. The idea here is that you should be able to bait the opposition players out and create more space then that your own teammate can move into, and then you can play the ball through. And again, once that's happened, you can start doing all of these movements all the way down the field where you're baiting in players and creating space that can then be attacked. That's a really important positional idea, and that's something that is fundamental to Julian Nagelsmann's teams. So Julian Nagelsmann is a positional coach, but rather than focusing on the rational occupation of space across the field in the way that many other positional coaches are, he's actually more interested in this second idea, this notion of creating space through baiting opposition players forward and generating space between the lines. And if we bring together these two tactical ideas, the concept of minimum space, but also the idea of generating space to then exploit, we arrive, I think, at the heart of what Julian Nagelsmann's football is all about. And I've got a lovely quote from Dani Olmo, who played under Nagelsmann at RB Leipzig, which really brings these two ideas together. So we start off with this concept of minimum width. Here we can play closer together. We rely on each other so that we can give the game more speed. If we play more spaced out, we can't play as fast as the coach wants us to. That's why we want to play as close together as possible, almost like a five-a-side football game. So that's the concept of minimum width, bringing the players together and being able to use the relations between the players as an important tactical aspect, as well as the spaces between them. And then in the second part of the quote, we have this other idea, this notion of generating space to exploit. So Olmo says, the smaller the space, the better, because the ball moves faster. We attract more rivals that way, but we need to know how to play under pressure. So that's the idea that by holding onto the ball and baiting the opposition towards you, you then generate spaces that can be exploited. And Olmo carries on, if we succeed, we open bigger spaces and we're able to attack with more depth. And that is, in a nutshell, Julian Nagelsmann's play style. But despite all of this, Julian Nagelsmann's flexibility still overrides his idealism, so don't be surprised if you see Nagelsmann playing a style of football that doesn't fit his ideal. And I think this shows up really nicely in his time at Bayern Munich, because when he gets to Bayern Munich, he is adopting a team from Hansi Flick, who is a very positional coach, and he uses those tactics largely in the first season there. That's the season when he wins the league. I've got a really nice example of what this looks like in practice from the Champions League game where they actually got knocked out of the Champions League against Real. And if we look at the board here, we can see this is just standard positional play. So we talked about the concept of maximum width, and we can see it on this slide here. So we can see the winger on one side, winger on the other, and then we can see the other attacking players filling in the spaces between this back line. And then at the back here, we can see that we've got a narrow back three, a sitting player here, and the idea is that they're going to be able to defend the ball from a turnover. They're going to sit narrow, force the opposition out wide, and make it easier to defend those transitions. But despite winning the Bundesliga, Julian Nagelsmann was not happy with the way his team were playing football in that first season, and in the summer comes out with a quote which says he's going to tear up the copybook and change the way that he's approaching things. So he says, "In my second season, I will somewhat deviate a bit from my path. I've learned over the past season how important each individual character is to form a team. That's partly even more important than teaching tactics." So what we've got here is this concept of a positional play, which offers a structure for the players to actually use to get upside from. But he's saying it's not just about that structure. We need to get the relations between those players working as well. We need to be able to get the players vibing off one another into the situations where they can make those quick passes, get through and score more goals. And so when Bayern Munich came back at the beginning of the next season, their play style had changed completely. So this is the Super Cup 2022, which is sort of the charity shield in Germany. This is the first game of the season, and as we can see, rather than doing the positional things that we've come to expect from the previous season, we can see that now there's much more of a flat back four. We're not seeing Alphonso Davies push all the way up the wide area to try and get onto the back line. He's actually staying much closer to his counterparts. We've got a double pivot here rather than the single pivot that we had before. And as you can see, the idea is to generate space in here to pull the opposition apart. You can see Thomas Muller dropping in here to try and pull Kevin Campbell out of the way, generating space then that the other players can move into. The attacking players can get the ball in these areas, get close together and generate these attacking moves. And if we fast forward to the attacking phase, we can see the same things here. So the back four, the double pivot, and then there's these attacking four players here. But what you should notice is that it's so narrow. So I've just drawn two lines here. The only players for Bayern outside those two lines are the fullbacks. Everyone else is within that space, and as we can see, you've got the perfect setup then to be able to generate space in between the lines of pressure, which you can then find. So we can see here Joshua Kimmich is dropping into this space to try and pull Konrad Laimer out of position, and we can see here Deo Upamecano is trying to pull Forsberg out. So the idea then is that you should be able to find this player in space. You can maybe play a 1-2 pass here and then find Thomas Muller now in space here. This is the perfect setup that you want for this more relational approach where you can move the ball through the lines of pressure and attack through the centre. So things very much changed in the second season at Bayern. But the problem is that Nagelsmann still isn't happy with the way that his team are playing. And so just before the World Cup break happens, he does what he always does and he tweaks things a little bit. The flexibility comes through. And what he does is we have this system with the back four, the double pivot, and then these fluid four attacking players. He actually takes one of the double pivot players out, replaces him with a striker, Eric Maxim Choupo-Moting, and then he has a bit more of a flat back four behind him here with just a single sitting player. But the problem is you can end up moving very easily from this sort of structure into positional play again. So you push your striker forward, your two wide players forward, your eights help them out. Alphonso Davies pushes into the final line. You have your sitter here, your narrow back three here. This is a really nice rest defense structure, and you're trying to overload the front line here with maximum width. We're back at positional play. But even this didn't work, and in the end, Nagelsmann's final months at Bayern were punctuated by him making these tactical tweaks to try and fix things whilst the team were actually dropping points. And I've actually got a screenshot here which shows you Bayern's setup for Nagelsmann's final game in charge. This was a 2-1 loss against Leverkusen, and as we can see, Bayern is set up in this 5-3-2 shape, which was the shape that Nagelsmann originally used at Hoffenheim. So we've gone full circle there. The flexibility has brought him back to where he started from. So why does everyone want Julian Nagelsmann? Well, that flexibility that we've seen running throughout his career makes him a super attractive prospect for clubs at every level. If you're at the bottom of the table, that flexibility allows you to be really reactive to teams around you, make it really hard for them to beat you. But if you're at the top of the table, that flexibility means that you can be really proactive and find ways of taking points off other teams to allow you to be really successful at the highest level. And because of this, Julian Nagelsmann will be a really hot property in the market this summer. But we have seen from his time at Bayern that this flexibility at the highest levels can sometimes become detrimental. And so it will be interesting to see that if he does move to an elite club next, how that plays out in future.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.